Welcome and thanks for taking the time to join us today. We appreciate that you're here to discuss our experience in creating and delivering policy at pace. But before we get into the content of today's webinar, we'll do some quick introductions. My name is Jackie Hagland and I lead the policy and regulatory practice here at Allen & Clark. I've been with Allen & Clark for about 11 and a half years and my background prior to Allen & Clark was in education and arts.
I'm Jason Carpenter. I'm a senior consultant in our policy and regulatory practice. Been here for 10 years and work across government in New Zealand and Australia on a range of topics.
Kia ora, my name is Stuart Beresford and I'm a senior consultant here at Allen & Clark. I've worked here for the last 8 years, but prior to joining Allen & Clark, I worked at the Ministry of Justice and was involved in a number of policy developments at pace, including responding to the 100-day plan of the John Key government when they were elected back in 2008.
Kia ora, my name is Emily Black and I'm also a senior consultant here at Allen & Clark in the policy and regulatory practice. My background is as a lawyer at the Ministry of Health and I spent quite a lot of time working on the COVID response when I was there.
Kia ora, thanks team. So Allen & Clark works across New Zealand and Australia for a range of government and non-government agencies, private sector companies and also international organisations. We have several specialities within our team, including evaluation and research, evidence-based policy analysis, regulatory development and implementation, business change and also international development assistance. A lot of our work includes supporting agencies to create and manage policy at pace, particularly when an urgent solution is needed. This webinar will explore which strategies they use and we use with them and how to plan for the work, including consultation and why you shouldn't skip it even when you feel like you could or need to, reporting to governance and leadership and working towards statutory timeframes and other requirements. So, on to our first question. What exactly are we talking about when we say policy at pace?
I think the big thing is most people listening are probably aware that policy development takes a really long time, a lot of resources, and often at least sort of 12 to 18 months from conceptualisation to implementation, and in many cases much longer. Urgent situations like we're going to talk about today can arise where sort of the decisions need the policy done in a much shorter time frame. And I think the key thing that we're talking about today is that something has normally happened externally that has made the need to do policy and make the decisions much quicker. So we're sort of talking about something's changed that we now need to move really fast.
Cool. So what kind of circumstances create the need for policy to be done at pace and how are they different?
Jackie, I think that emergencies are the obvious example. You know, and in New Zealand recently we've had many shock events, emergencies that are still top of mind. Natural disasters such as Cyclone Gabrielle, the health crisis around COVID, the measles outbreak in Auckland a few years ago. Then we've also had emergencies driven by biosecurity risks. A good example of that was the recent outbreak of M. bovis. But we've also had some external challenges. One of the issues that I worked on was responding to the mass arrival of asylum seekers, which occurred in around 2009, 2010. But there are also a number of other examples, and these are mainly in the political arena. A new government that wants to implement their immediate priorities, for instance, the current government's or the soon-to-be current government's 100-day plan, or there might be a change of minister, a change of direction with regard to policy, that there might be more changes in government priorities that may follow, for instance, a budget. There could be changes in public perceptions and there could be, policy driven at pace because of, media interests or other, public community interests. But other urgent situations that require policy to be done at pace could include responding to statutory deadlines. There could be a sunset clause in a particular piece of legislation that requires policy to be developed to respond to that. It may be that there's a cabinet or a ministerial report back that is sets the deadlines for when things happen. And the other thing that, look, quite often policy is developed at pace because, something just hasn't been given the priority that it needed to have, and then all of a sudden, we've got to actually develop that policy quickly in order to respond to that priority issue. So in terms of my key takeaway is that, look, you've got to understand the causes of policy at pace and why that's important. It usually starts with a deadline being imposed externally, which is what Jason mentioned, requiring policy advisors to work backwards instead of working forwards. And that there are a number of policy at pace scenarios, more than just emergencies, but there are plenty of lessons to learn from the emergencies and situations that we've had recently, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about that a little bit more later.
Cool, thanks Stu. So what are some of the differences in between kicking off new policy versus the rapid speed up of programs that are already underway?
Well, the obvious difference, as Stu just mentioned, is those timeframes. Usually you're running on a much shorter time frame and you have to adapt all the usual elements of the policy process and make really conscious decisions about what needs to be squeezed and what actually can't be squeezed. As Stu mentioned, talking about that working backwards with the timeframes rather than working forwards, so you don't get to start and decide how long it's going to take. You often get an imposed deadline and you have to work backwards to figure out how you're going to make that deadline. To that end, policy at pace usually requires really, really strong planning. You generally can't afford to make mistakes or to change direction halfway through, so that means you have to have some really good planning up front. What we've found in our experience is that often that emergency response is actually quite useful for all policy at pace. So if you're taking that programmatic approach, you're using sit reps, you're using work streams, it creates an easy structure for people to work with, and it sets you up quite well for success. It also is a good way to try and mitigate the risk of staff burning out because they're working really hard. It means everyone knows what's expected of them. You're usually setting roles and responsibilities out really clearly for people. And it means that you can understand when there's the opportunity to rest if you're working really, really quickly. If something goes out for consultation, take the rest of the day off while you're waiting for it to come back. It also makes it easier to ask for more things. You can ask for more resources if you need more resources because you've done the planning and you can demonstrate why you need it and where you need it. It also helps, I know sometimes you have hard deadlines that you can't push back on, but sometimes it helps to push back on timing a little bit if you've done your planning really well and you can really clearly set out, this actually will take this long, so we have to push the deadline out. One example that comes to mind for me, I worked on the changes to the COVID Act to change the sunset clause. So you mentioned a sunset clause, hard deadline, lots of legislative process requirements that you have to meet. And the person who was running the process was so organised, and she had set up the whole timeline, the whole calendar of us running that process, and it meant that she asked for more resource. That's why I came in the first place. It meant everyone understood their roles and responsibilities really, really clearly, and everyone came in with certain expertise. So there was an element of team building there to make sure that it worked efficiently. And it also meant that she could report up to seniors and be really, really clear about what needed to be done and when it needed to be done by. So I guess the key takeaway from that is having clear roles and responsibilities, having really, really good planning. Even if you're doing stuff at pace, it's worth putting the time and effort in to do that planning. Sometimes you have to do it alongside your other work streams, but that doesn't mean that you should skimp on the planning phase at all. And usually you're not starting from scratch when you're doing policy at pace, so use what you've got and build on that.
And also, it's look after your staff.
And look after yourself, of course. Sorry, that should have been number one.
Because I mean, as an example there, back in 2008, when the new national government came in, a lot of the program I was at the Ministry of Justice, we had a number of items on the 100-day plan that had to be worked through. But I do remember, being in the office late, and the team managers were, buying dinner. They were making sure that people got breaks. They would tell people to go out and go for a walk to get some fresh air, to really look after themselves. But they also knew that, look, you know, that this was a very short period, but once it was finished, they could then like take a breather and then they could relax.
Thanks. So when you're gearing up to deliver policy at pace, what are some of the things that you need to think about?
I think the big one, if you've already been working on that issue for a while, is that in the policy at pace framing, the expectations are different, the tactics are different, and often the team needs are a bit different. You really need people that can come in, that are comfortable with ambiguity, comfortable making hard decisions into short time frames, potentially without all the information, but to really have that focus on what does the decision maker need to make a good decision or the best possible decision under the time frames, and to then work back from that. So with gearing up from something, you often have a bit more baggage than something brand new. So you might have been consulting, you might have already had papers to council or cabinet or the decision maker. So everyone has expectations and things might have been ruled in or out. So you have to sort of have that understanding, but then also really respect that the circumstances may well have changed. If it's a new government, if it's a new minister, something's happened that meant that the priority is now different. You have to really think about what's caused the need for the policy at pace. What are we basing this decision on? What information does that decision maker need, and how do we then get it to them? I think, you know, some of the big long-term things like, you know, RMA, Three Waters, the big chunky policy issues, the information that you may have may not change, and you know, but suddenly the appetite for the decision is what's changed. And so I think really seeing it as an opportunity to get the decision made, but also recognizing that the skills to make the hard calls, to sort of have a bit of flexibility in how you're going to approach it, with, you know, being a bit more clear about what you actually need to make that decision, and then setting the team up to deliver it. That's this kind of difference, that hard decisions done at pace, often without the full context that you may otherwise have.
So is policy sometimes done better quickly than actually at a more slow or normal pace?
I think that's a good question. And look, all policy is done better when it's done with care. It needs to be thorough, it needs to be meticulous. But policy development is complex, and policymakers need to make trade-offs. Sometimes the benefit of having a hard deadline is that it encourages people to work through and accept those trade-offs, which they wouldn't necessarily do with a normal process. So there are some benefits of doing policy at pace. And we saw the effectiveness of working quickly, you know, when we were encountering the COVID-19 pandemic. We utilised the best available evidence, and we made significant and timely policy decisions during that process. But another example that we've worked on, and Jason and I have been involved in, is, look, you know, it's the Māori land reforms that the current government progressed after they took power back in 2017. When they were elected, the Labour government withdrew a bill that was sort of like progressing through the House as part of their election commitments, that was making a wholesale change to Māori land law. A few months later, however, it became apparent that some aspects of that policy piece, that reform, were actually needed, and that legislative changes had to be developed, and developed quickly, in order for them to be enacted within that parliamentary term. These changes, or at least the development of these changes, were progressed at pace, and we were able to do that by relying on the analysis and the stakeholder consultation that had occurred previously. We drew on that information because it was still applicable, and that this ensured that the issues that took a long time to work through as part of the previous process didn't get in the way of having to develop that policy, or at least the identifying the issues and getting cabinet approval rapidly. But you do need to be clear, you need to be crystal clear around what you're trying to achieve. People may be unhappy about progressing at speed, but the best decisions are to try and achieve a solid and well-reasoned outcome. You need to, and that means you may need to make assumptions, and you need to have like parameters around the decisions that you need to be making. But you also need to build into this process opportunities to review, and you need to make changes when to the policy that you're developing when needed. Look, the reality is that nothing is set in stone, and if you take that approach, it will enable you to adapt when new evidence becomes available or circumstances change. So look, my key takeaway, Jackie, is that look, policy at pace works best when everyone is working together towards a mutual goal. You need to establish that goal at the outset, and that is crucial for getting that collaborative approach. Even if you have to go off tangent, you still need to be working towards that outcome, and you need to know what you're trying to achieve, and everybody needs to be on the same page when doing so.
Thanks, Stuart. That's really good. I just thought I'd quickly share the results of the poll because I think it's kind of relevant here. So the question was, what's the biggest challenge you've faced when working on policy at pace? So 43% of the respondents so far have commented on the consultation process as being their biggest challenge. 21% have said decision makers not acting in a timely manner. So we've talked about that, so really interested to see that. Another one we've touched on already is around 21% said the appropriate review procedures and making sure that they are implemented. And finally, 15% have selected that the principles of te tiriti or waitangi falling to the wayside as their biggest challenge. So on to our next question, thorough versus fast. Is it a true trade-off?
No, I mean, I think Stu set it out quite nicely. It doesn't necessarily have to be a true trade-off. There are some really great policies made at pace. But you do, like Jason said, you need the right people to do it. And there are some things that you really can't do well at pace. So setting up new infrastructure, establishing new organisations just don't work that well when you're trying to do them really, really quickly. There are also some hard processes that you just have to meet. It's really useful to build them into your planning right at the beginning so you don't get tripped up by an extra cabinet date that you have to urgently book in, or getting tripped up by having to get an exemption from the 28-day rule because you forgot about it, been there. The other things that are important to remember when you're working at pace is giving yourself that flexibility not to be perfect. So people have already identified the fact that building a review in can be really challenging when you're doing policy at pace, and that's another thing that we see really often. If you don't do it at the beginning, it often falls by the wayside by the end because everyone's exhausted. So that's something that is really important to push for in that planning phase, making sure that once you've done the policy at pace, you're all exhausted, then it goes off to someone else to do a review, some monitoring, evaluation, something so that that policy can be held to account and to make changes if needed. If it's legislative, this is the lawyer in me speaking, it's important to try and keep your drafting as flexible as possible within reason, within the rule of law, to make sure that you have room to change if you need to, because it's almost impossible to kind of see all those consequences down the line when you're doing something really, really quickly. It's also really important to get all the information that you need as early as possible. So that consultation process, it can be really, really challenging, especially when you're doing it fast because you're doing it on your terms rather than the people you're consulting with terms. One of the things that we've found really useful in our experience is that you go out to people early in a relatively informal manner to engage them and get them on board. That helps kind of in two ways. It helps for you to understand the information that you might need, that you might not have come across yet, but it also creates those relationships. So when you do have to make sometimes unreasonable requests down the line, you've started creating the trust, you've created the relationships, and they might be able to point you in the direction of who then you should consult with, or they might be the people that you need to consult with completely. I guess one of the takeaways there is that often the outcome needs to be reverse engineered rather than the traditional way of working through a policy process to come to an outcome. And it often comes top down rather than bottom up, but that doesn't mean that you can't consult in a way that's meaningful and genuine and create those trusts and take on board that bottom up approach where possible to understand what's actually going on in the sector that you're working with, or for the stakeholders that are on the ground.
I think the building trust with the stakeholders goes upwards as well. So the question or the poll talking about the decision makers and them not making timely decisions, I think that it really speaks to the need to build trust with the decision maker really quickly. And as we said, often they might be new into the sector, they might have come with a different set of priorities, and so they may not know you, they may not have that sort of track record with you. And so really thinking about what they're trying to achieve, being empathetic to their needs, and then working out how you're going to interact with them. And so the main thing is that while it's not sexy, is that what and how you report up to the decision makers just becomes really, really important, because it will be the main way that you do interact with the decision makers. Talking about like outcomes of what you're trying to do, you're landing a plane, everyone wants to land it safely, but you've got your different indicators and different dials that tell you whether you're on track. It's thinking about what do you actually need to know that you're on track, and what does that decision maker expect to see to know that you're on track. And so there's a real balance between not over-reporting but also not under-reporting. So I think really planning out and agreeing what you're going to report when. And then I think one of the big things is that it does create a lot of resource needs, the reporting. And so it's something that is often under-resourced, is that you do need people really focused on that reporting. But if you don't do it and you don't do it well, it's the easiest way to just lose trust. You've all been in that meeting where the minister says, where are we up to? It's like, you don't have that answer ready to go. But if you have the document, you have the little things tracking across the Gantt chart, whatever it is, that can just really fill them with confidence, so that they see where it's going, they know what's coming, they know what to look for, and they feel that they're getting the right information to then make the hard decision in a timely manner. And that's really what we're trying to get to, is they are going to have to be the ones who are, the buck stops with them. They have to make the decision. They have to feel comfortable that they've got the right information, knowing that it's a trade-off, knowing that it's a hard decision, and that's why we're doing policy at pace.
And sometimes that emergency way of running things helps with the reporting, because you might do daily stand-ups or really regular stand-ups or sit reps. That helps people build confidence, the decision makers build confidence in what's happening and understand what's happening, rather than having it in, on the pile of their emails.
And I think that regular contact is also appropriate, not just with ministers and the decision makers, but also with those people that are going to be impacted by the policy, your stakeholders. You need to be sort of like, as you mentioned, like engaging with them early. You need to be engaging with them often. You need to bring them on that journey, and agree on the outcomes, and make sure that they're very clear on what those outcomes are. You may not get them to 100% agreement, but hopefully they agree on the approach, and hopefully they acknowledge that they've been given an opportunity to comment. Look, during the COVID pandemic, as some of you may recall, when we went into lockdown, a number of businesses were just not, they encountered a number of barriers that were legislative and due to the regulatory framework within which businesses were operating. And so the government enacted the COVID-19 Response Further Measures, Management Measures Legislation Act, and to enable businesses to better respond to the effects of COVID-19. So that, for instance, gave businesses the ability to have annual general meetings by electronically as opposed to in person, and to do electronic signatures as opposed to written signatures, as an example. The legislation was developed, drafted and enacted in a way that, in a matter of weeks, I was involved, not at MB, but as one of the other agencies, supporting agencies on that legislation. And throughout that period, MB kept in close contact with with business leaders, with particularly peak bodies such as the Institute of Directors, to ensure that the proposals were fully understood, that they were workable, and that they met the needs of business. And in fact, one of those involved described it as one of the best policy processes that they had been involved in, even though it was done at pace, because of this, the amount of consultation, the amount of discussions that they had. Yes, they didn't go out to the full community. Yes, they didn't go out to all business leaders, but they went to the right people to seek. That targeted consultation was done very, very well. So I do think that you need to, when working at pace, particularly with consulting stakeholders, you need to identify who is the best people that you need to speak to and speak to them often and regularly. You can draw on, as I described earlier, previous consultation processes. If you've consulted about, for instance, these business chambers as part of COVID, when the government encountered the same issues around Cyclone Gabrielle, we'd already done that consultation, and you could rely on what business needed in order to put in place those emergency measures. Look, some people, because it's done at pace and there could be issues around confidentiality, look, you might want to think about, getting the people you're consulting with to sign or to enter into a confidentiality agreement. And maybe you want to utilise existing reference groups as well. And so those are the last little tips that I'd have in that space.
And sometimes as well, the places like, Productivity Commission or Law Commission or, other bodies may have consulted on a similar issue, like having a look around to see what has been done and whether it is relevant, and is there anything you can draw out to sort of shortcut some of those processes, even like who to talk to. They may have had a reference group, so people that have been talked to about that issue previously or really engaged at that policy level.
Yeah. So in that last, part of that last discussion we've just had, we talked about managing up and reporting up. So does that differ depending on who's driving the policy?
Yes, it does. No, it does differ, and it differs quite a bit. I mean, look, policy at pace is often ministerial led instead of being led by an agency or led by the senior management within that agency. And so at times there is a higher level of governance, a higher level of oversight that then is required. This means that as we've said before, that the driver of the policy comes from the top rather than it being the policy unit or that's involved. A good example of this, and I alluded it to earlier, was that in 2010, urgent legislation was required to ensure that the immigration system could handle a mass arrival of asylum seekers should one occur. At the time, there was an attempt by a boat carrying approximately 70, Sri Lankan asylum seekers, which was heading to New Zealand, but unfortunately, it didn't get here because of bad weather. The policy was led by the Minister of Immigration, but the Prime Minister, John Key, took an active interest in that work, and he chaired several interagency meetings on this issue. That was because it was urgent, and it was also part of that wider package of work around disrupting and deterring people smuggling. So yes, and it is, I think, a good example of where you can get the Prime Minister directly looking at the issue, and COVID is another example of that. And that means that you end up having to report, as you've mentioned earlier, more frequently. It will be less formal. There'll be different ways of reporting than doing a weekly note to the minister. And again, in 2008, when the last national government came in and they introduced their 100-day plan, as I've mentioned, the Ministry of Justice, where I was working at the time, was asked to work on several aspects of that 100-day plan. The Deputy Secretary held daily stand-ups of the teams that were involved, where he brought representatives from each of those teams in, and they gave a quick 1 to 2 minute overview of what they were going to, of where the issue that they were working on, where that was. And then at the end of the day, we had to prepare written notes where we sort of just highlighted what we'd done that day, where we were up to, and highlighting any issues and any matters that we'd encountered. He also appointed one person who sort of managed the whole of that work stream. And there was a number of different projects that fell within the 100-day work stream, so that he could have visibilities, and that's where your Gantt charts came in. That's where your other reports came in, which meant that he could go to ministers and he could say with confidence this is where this piece of work is at. And that was received really well by Simon Power, the Minister of Justice at the time, and to the point where, you know, he thanked, you know, everyone involved personally and brought us all together. So look, and the other thing that I would say is that it also meant that, you know, any problems, any issues that were identified could be were known by the senior leadership straight away, and it meant that they could then take appropriate action to ensure that there's you know, that they were effectively managed. So yes, there is increased risk by having senior leadership involved, but there's also an opportunity because it will get things done quicker. You know, when the ministers, you know, during their 100-day plan, they were really keen to make sure that things, you know, that were landed and landed well. So that means you do have to build trust. We've said that a few times, but once trust is there, you know, generally the ministers will let you do your work within reason, as long as you over-communicate, being clear about, and also being clear about what you don't know. And then, yeah, make sure people are on the same page. People get, you know, our reports to the Deputy Secretary also went to the other members of the Ministry of Justice's senior leadership team. So they were on board about, and they knew about what we were doing.
Yeah, and that gives you the mandate to, you know, do things quickly, but also, you know, make changes, make decisions.
And also
because
meant
you have
that,
to.
yeah, when we had to go and talk with our operational staff, they were aware of when that was likely to occur and what their involvement would be in that process. So it didn't come as a surprise.
Cool, thanks. Moving on to the next topic, which is around how do you balance quality with delivery when it comes to outputs and decisions?
I think that's kind of cuts to the heart of the whole topic, and it's the really crucial one with this. And I think the biggest thing is having the right people. So if you need to do consultation, having people that already have connections, that's massive, but who already have connections across government, like those sorts of things where you can have a more informal process to get things done quickly while still having the assurance that it's going to be done well. And when you have that really clear focus on the outcome, working out where you can cut corners, you know, be a little bit creative with things like procurement. You know, these can be really good rules for good reasons, but there may be equally good reasons, you know, to try and work out how to use the emergency powers. Procurement normally has ones you can get through, you know, the dark arts, and that a lot of that does come with experience of having been through them, but just having that right person that understands the processes but isn't bound to them, can work out ways to make them work for them, you know, things like 28-day rules, knowing when you can, you know, ask for exemptions, when you can't, just really sort of saying consciously, these are things that have to be done, I'm crunching this one, I'm not crunching that one, here's the trade-offs, but then making it a really clear decision, building it into the planning, and then sort of, you know, building out from there. And I think that the key thing with all of that is just the clear outcomes of what you're trying to achieve. You can fall into risks with policy at pace of sort of creating little logic boxes where all your decisions make sense in this little silo of, you know, hurried, frenzied activity. But if you actually took a bigger, broader step, you'd realize that you're sort of, while they're internally consistent, you're missing some of the opportunities to do something bigger. You may not be aligning with what other people are doing. So I think just being really careful with, you know, with how you are going to cut the corners, taking the time to really understand what you're doing, but then also just, you know, making sure that you are sort of keeping the longer, bigger term view as well while you're doing that.
Cool. Thanks, team. I'm actually going to jump forward to the top 10 tips for policy at pace, because I really want to make sure that we capture these. So, yeah, really keen to hear, what are your guys' top tips?
Well, look, the first one is pre-planning. And I think that, you know, while, as we've said, look, a lot of policy at pace is driven by emergency, it doesn't mean to say that you can't pre-plan for, you might not know what the type of emergency is, but we are going to have a significant weather event again, and we can plan for that. That means, like, you could develop policy templates that could be rolled out and utilised, you know, quickly when needed. You can create and establish multidisciplinary teams that can then be brought together quickly, that will have the experts that are needed in order to develop that policy at pace. You need to go back to come forward. You need to think about what we've done in the past and how the policy that we've developed previously can support and help, you know, the situation that we are now encountering. You've got to also look at what is the best way to give effect to that change? How, you know, do you need to actually do legislative change, or can it be done, for instance, through regulation, or can it be done through just through changing behaviour? The other one is that, you know, as we've talked about, that, you know, government agencies and actors need to be collaborative. We need to work together as agencies, and we also need to work together with stakeholders, and at the very minimum with the key stakeholders, those representative groups that support and speak on behalf of stakeholders and of people through New Zealand. The other thing that I think is quite important is that the decisions need to be based on robust, real-time information, and that, you know, we shouldn't be relying on, you know, yesterday's information to make those decisions, but we need that, you know, what is the latest information. And then we also need to make sure that we are very transparent and about what we're doing, and that we provide, you know, the people who need to know with effective communications. And so that includes the public. So they need to know what is actually happening in that regard. You know, review is really important. Build that into the, you know, the life cycle of the regulatory reform. So it means, that, you know, when you're developing things at pace, just be aware that, it's going to be reviewed as part of good regulatory stewardship at some stage. And so you do need to be aware that is going to be, is going to happen. And then always talk about limitations and risks. Always communicate that. It's our job as a policy advisor to make sure that that's communicated effectively to ministers. At the end of the day, they are responsible for that policy. They are responsible. If it fails, they are responsible to the public for that policy failure. So do let them know that where there are, limitations or risks. If you don't know all of the information, or you don't have all the evidence, make sure that's very clear to them, to ministers when you talk to them.
Well, one thing that we haven't mentioned yet, which is a bit of an oversight from us, is te tiriti o waitangi. It's really important for your consultation that you're consulting with relevant Māori leaders and stakeholders as early as possible. Something that we hear, because we're kind of in that independent zone and we go out and speak to a lot of stakeholders often, is that Māori are not talked to early enough. And it's like what we talked about before with everyone, is building trust, and sometimes it's relying on some of those informal connections to talk to people early about what's happening and to understand the impacts early, rather than taking a fully, designed policy out to consultation and learning that it's going to be all wrong, for a significant population group.
And I think if you take the articles in Kawanatanga, if it is possible, if there is a group that exists, if there is people that exist to bring Māori into the top table to help make the decisions at the start, that's the easiest way to do it if you can, and do acknowledge that that's not always possible. And then if you are having to make policy at pace and you're trying to think about equity considerations, most departments have tools and templates and that sort of thing, but it's really the more you can have those engagements early, the better it's always going to be. But taking the articles and thinking about, if you're trying to have an outcome of funding out to the community, is there a way to build in tiratanga around, we're going to give more money with some rules and responsibilities to iwi groups to deliver themselves versus setting up a new agency, and just thinking about how you can build in the principles of the treaty and the articles, arititanga, you bring in how you're going to build equity through your delivery. Just thinking about at the earliest possible stage, having really good familiarity with te tiriti, but ideally already having those discussions with the groups in the policy area you're working on. That's the ultimate, and we understand it's not always possible, but you will just have to, best endeavours, you do have deadlines, so it's always going to be hard. I think it's always going to be hard.
That relates directly to one of the questions that have come through. So you guys absolutely hit the nail on the head there, which is around discussing how to deal with challenges with engaging with iwi Māori. And one of the things that we've noticed and sort of has come up a lot in some of the work that we've done is around recognising that lots of consultation from different organisations is underway with Māori and iwi organisations. And so there's no need to start from scratch. And what you actually should be doing is reaching out to organisations or looking at whether organisations such as the Waitangi Tribunal or the Law Commission or others have already consulted with iwi Māori groups and a topic that is related to what you're talking to. So you're not starting from scratch. You're building on that consultation. You're building on what's already been learned from others. And that also reduces the impact and the effort required by those organisations and responding to yet another round of consultation.
And the other thing that we've found is sometimes you can jump in on other consultation that's currently happening, as long as it's closely enough related that it works. But we've found on some of the projects that we've done that the agency that we're doing the work for is already doing consultation in a similar space, and so we've been able to jump in and do some consultation, maybe double the time, but it means it's one session instead of two different sessions with different people coming in, and that's really helpful to try and, first of all, it means that the people that you're consulting with are already established and there's a time set up, and it also means that you're not getting that consultation fatigue that sometimes hits.
And so some of the more practical things, like if you're having consultation, build in time to share the information and not necessarily expect a decision from those people right then. Let them have time to go and consult with their community and come back in a week or 2 weeks or whatever's possible to sort of let them take the lead on how they're going to collect some of those views and then build that into the process if it's possible. It can be really challenging if you're a community leader asked to come to a meeting and make a decision for your whole community right now, otherwise you're going to miss the boat. But it can be hard, depends on the timeframes, but trying to build in more flexible ways to get the views into the process is the best you can do.
And I think that will, if you take that approach, you can avoid some of the policy failure, the risk of policy failure. The other thing that we haven't touched on is that, look, there are a range of factors that will complicate developing policy at pace. These are things that seem that they're statutory requirements. For instance, what we've just talked about is Tiriti, but you also need to all policy needs to make sure that it complies with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. It also needs to make sure that that the Privacy Act and other international requirements that we may have are recognised and adhered to. And that if we don't give thought to those issues, then not only will the policy be criticised, but it may end up being struck down in court because it's inconsistent with, for instance, the right to be free from discrimination. And so we do need to take into account those aspects when developing policy at pace. Fortunately, there are a number of good people and experts across government that have that knowledge, that experience, and talk to people at the Ministry of Justice, at Crown Law, and even at PCO, the Parliamentary Council Office, who are very aware of what those statutory requirements are. And that's something that I would also add, is that when you're talking to your stakeholders, PCO is a stakeholder. You need to make sure that they are very much part of that conversation so that they can give and they are very aware of how long it's going to take to draft that piece of legislation, that regulatory change that you want to make.
And they're often having to make prioritisation decisions internally around what's going to be promoted. So getting the discussion early, so if you do need to, seek something to be reprioritised to fit it into the deadline, you can have that conversation as early as possible. And things like, does the Chief Justice want to comment on your policy proposal because it is seen as high risk? Those things that can come up, they will add to your time frame, but you have to be aware they may happen, plan for it, and ask the question of is this needed in this case, and then try and build that in as much as you can. And a lot of that speaks to having the right team. So people that have done it, that have been through those processes, that understand the human rights aspects, they can not shortcut it, but just understand where the trade-offs are going to be. And so if the Minister, you make this decision, there will be a trade-off that you're having to make. You put in a new search power, you're impinging on something else, and then make it conscious. I think that's the big one. Just don't do anything by accident. That's the worst, is if you put some advice up and then you find out later that it's breaching human rights or privacy implications, etc. So just really having the right people that know that can then work flexibly to put the best possible
and
solution.
communicate that to ministers, to those decision makers. I mean, having been in the minister's office, the minister that I work with was really comfortable with, you saying to him that, look, the Chief Justice will have a comment, or the Chief District Court Judge will have a comment on this piece of work, and then so that they are aware that you are engaging with that person, as opposed to getting that letter from the Chief District Court Judge at the end of the process saying, I don't support this, and then having to go through an additional consultation right at the end, which delays the implementation of that reform.
Well, thank you everyone. That's been a really good session. Jason, do you have any final comments?
I think probably reiterating what I've already said is around really thinking about the team that you need to deliver on the policy. So the people that are comfortable working at pace, making bold decisions, working flexibly to achieve an outcome, and just really making sure that they are primed and ready for the busy period, building in the breaks, but letting them know that there will be a relatively intense period with some tough decisions built into it.
And my wrap up would be that over communicate, make sure that you express what you're doing often and regularly to the decision makers.
Mine's really boring. Planning is the most important thing, and the better you plan, the better your outcomes are going to be. So put the time in at the beginning to set up your process well, so that you can follow it easily and avoid some of the hiccups that come from lack of planning.
And just adding to that, it's a shared understanding of what you're doing and why, and so that when you do go to another agency and ask for input, they understand the basis that you're operating, how they need to interact with you, and what the priority is and how it's going to relate to everything else.
Absolutely.
Cool. Thanks, guys. Look, I've actually really enjoyed hearing you guys and sharing your experiences and the way that and the times that Allen and Clark have been involved with supporting agencies around actually, implementing policy at pace. It can be a terrifying time to a certain extent when suddenly you get a big push from minister or leadership. But actually, that's a real opportunity where there's no need to start from scratch. Organisations have been through this process, they've learnt from it before, and we've had the real privilege at Allen and Clark of working with organisations through that process. Kia ora. So thank you again for taking the time to join us today. We hope that you've found this webinar useful and gained some insights around implementing policy at pace. Please do have a look around our website. You'll see a number of other webinars that we've run over the year, and also you'll see our program for what's coming up. So thank you.